Hey guys, Terry Martin back with another video. So today we're going to do a little bit of troubleshooting and debugging, which is an extremely useful skill that I know a lot of newer programmers and maybe even not so newer programmers can sometimes have a lot of trouble getting good at, okay, or even just getting reasonably good at. So this will probably not be the only time that we will do this sort of exercise. Basically, whenever I have a student who reaches out to me with an issue like what we're going to look at now, and I determine that it might make for a decent video, I might turn it into a video for the channel, okay? All right, so that's what we're going to do here. So this issue comes to me by way of one of my students who was working on this code, which comes from my Java course, okay? So I guess she was kind of just copying along with my course or following along or whatever, and she tried to run this program. I think it's a she. Sorry if you're not a she. I'm very, very sorry. Your name seems like it might be a girl's name though. Okay. Anyway, so she wrote this code or followed me, or maybe she pulled it down from my GitHub, I don't know, and tweaked it or something, but it's not working for her. So let me try to very concisely explain what the issue is here. Now, let me just warn you, if you haven't taken my Java course and you're not a Java programmer, you should still stick around because you'll get a chance to just kind of see in general, like, what's it like to sort of try to figure some stuff out, I suppose, but you strongly should consider taking my course. And if you are already in the course, but you're not this far along within the course yet, that's fine. You should still stick around and see how this goes, okay? All right, so I'm going to try to explain this really, really quickly. Basically, what we've got here is a text block that represents a list of people. So you can think of this list of people or employees here, kind of like imagine if we were in Excel in a spreadsheet and we had a bunch of rows of employee data or something, okay? That's what this sort of represents. And we're storing all this data in this variable called people text, okay? All right, and then down here, the gist of what this code is trying to do is it is trying to convert all of this text data into Java objects so that it can then sort the objects by last name, then first name, and then salary. So again, imagine that we're in Excel and we've got all that data and you right click on each of those columns for the first name, last name, and or last name, first name, and date of birth, and you tell Excel to sort by those columns, okay? So that's what we're doing here. And then we are converting all of these records or rows into a salary, okay? And the salaries are actually being calculated based on data that is associated with each of these lines. I won't get into the algorithms or the approach that we're using to do that because it doesn't really matter. But basically, there's Java code for each of the different types of employees. There's different types like programmers, managers, and analysts. And depending on what type of employee you are, we use different calculations or different approaches to determine what that person's salary should be, okay? So we're converting each of them into a salary, and then we're just adding up all of the salaries and then printing them out, okay? That's what this code here is meant to do. And it's doing this in a functional way using the Java Streams API. All right, so the problem is that this student got all this code written up or whatever she did to get this code, and then she ran it, let me run it, and it blew up on her. And by blow up, I mean like, you know, it's not working correctly. And we know this because of all this red stuff here. This red stuff is called a stack trace, okay? And it's bad news if you get this, okay? So I don't know how far she got into things after she got the stack trace, but I'm going to just assume that she didn't really know what to do at this point. And that's cool. I mean, this is a very typical situation to run into. So let's see if we can figure this out together, all right? So she's getting a null pointer exception. And let me explain very briefly what a null pointer exception is. And I explain it more deeply in my Java course. But basically, anytime we are referencing an object, and an example of an object would be, for example, like this string here, we're storing a reference to this string inside of this variable called people text, okay? But if I didn't set this data on this variable, that's another way of saying we're storing a reference in the variable. If we didn't do this and we did something like, let's see, string, another string, and I just put a semicolon there, so I'm not actually defining anything, I'm not initializing this variable, or I'm not setting any data on the variable, then by default, this variable here is null. Null means empty. If you're British, it'll be nil, okay? So it's nil or null. It's just not set. And that's fine, but you shouldn't try to make any kind of calls on any methods that might exist on this object here, okay? So this data becomes a string. Strings are objects. Objects have methods, which are functions for those of you who are not from the Java world, okay? You will not be able to make any method or function calls on an object that does not exist, okay? And that's basically what's happening down here. By the way, I'm just using this as an example. The stack trace here in this null pointer exception is not referring to this variable here, okay? It's referring to some other variable that hasn't been set, okay? I'm just explaining what a null pointer exception generally is. So we've got some object somewhere that the code thought would be set to some object, okay? But in fact, it isn't set. And that's a problem because that code is trying to call a function or a method on that object. And since the object doesn't exist, neither does the function. And so the code is blowing up. That's what's happening. All right, let me get rid of that little example there. Now, we want to know, well, where is this happening and what is the nature of it, right? So if we kind of scan to the right here, Java actually tells us a little bit more information. It's telling us that we were dealing apparently with a variable of type local date, and the code tried to call the equals method of a local date, but again, this local date must not actually exist. It must be null, okay? So we've got a variable of type local date that is meant to be pointing to an object of type local date in memory, but it's actually pointing to nowhere. Then we're trying to call the equals method of the local date, but that's the equals method of an object that doesn't exist. And so the code is blowing up, all right? And it looks like the variable that is actually of type local date that we're trying to use here is a date of birth field, okay? Now I happen to know that there is a date of birth field for a class called employee, all right? So each of these lines of text is getting converted into some type of an employee class, okay? And let me just show you here. Let's jump over to the employee class. In fact, you know what? I have a class diagram here that will show you some of what this project is kind of trying to do. So we've got this employee class here. You can ignore these two bits up here for now, I guess. But we've got an employee class here. And then we've got some other classes that inherit from the employee class. Java is an object-oriented language, and because of that, it has things like class inheritance and stuff, okay? So we've got these more specific types of employees, such as programmer, manager, and analyst, but they all inherit from or extend the employee class, hence the little blue arrows there. But on this employee class itself, we've got properties such as a last name, a first name, and a date of birth, okay? And all of these subclasses here, programmer, manager, and analyst, they are inheriting those properties, those three properties from the employee class. And then they can also add in their own additional properties that are more specific to a programmer or a manager or an analyst, okay? So I'm just kind of giving you a little bit of the big picture there. All right, let's jump back over to here now. All right, so so the employee class, one of its properties is a date of birth field, okay? And that field is of type local date, and it must be null, okay? So in other words, we've got code that's kind of parsing through each of these lines, and for each line here, it's trying to create an instance of an employee, like a programmer or a manager or an analyst, okay? And apparently, I'm guessing for at least one of these attempts to convert the text into an employee, the date of birth just isn't there, okay? It's not getting populated or something, okay? So we need to figure out where that's happening and why that's happening, okay? Well, so the easiest thing for us to do here is that the stack trace here is already telling us, if we keep looking at this stack trace right here on the very next line, it's saying, well, you've got some code here on line 100 of the employee class. And that is the last place that worked right before this null pointer exception was thrown. So I'm going to click on that, and that takes us right to line 100 on the employee class, okay? And so we see here in this equals method that, what are we doing here? Last name dot equals blah, 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 and first name. Okay, so the equals method in Java is generally used to compare two objects that should be of the same type to determine whether or not they are equal, okay? And so in this case, what's happening is this equals method would be comparing two employee instances, okay, to determine whether or not they are the same. And the way it's doing that is by actually just drilling in and comparing their last name. So it's saying, hey, for these two employees, if this guy's last name and this guy's last name are the same, and this guy's first name and this guy's first name are the same or equal, and this guy's date of birth and this guy's date of birth are the same, then they're the same, okay? That's what this code is doing. But I guess what's happening here is that when it gets to the date of birth, I'm guessing that this date of birth variable right here, which is a field of the class, or of the object rather, this guy is null for one of those employee instances, okay? I think that's what's happening, all right? So now we want to know, well, why is that happening? And I think what I would do is probably just start by setting a breakpoint right here on line 100 and then running the code and kind of just trying to understand what's the nature of, of the objects when we see that occur, okay? Now, let me go ahead and let's see. So you saw what I did here was I just clicked, let me click on that again and it'll go away. So if I come over here to this gutter area and just click once, that sets a breakpoint, okay? And that allows me to debug the program. So I'm gonna run this program again, but I'm going to run it in a debugging mode so that when the program or the thread gets to this line of code here, before it runs the code, it'll actually just pause and it will wait for me to tell it to proceed. And that'll give me a chance to just kind of freeze time and inspect all the data that's going on in the program at that point. Well, all the relevant data at least, okay? And then I can kind of just see, well, what is happening here, okay? Because I don't know. Honestly, I do know, but I'm going to pretend like I don't know for you, okay? All right, so I set that breakpoint over here, but I'm going to jump back into where we start, okay, because this is the start of the program, and then I can run this. Now, I can right-click on this and then choose debug, or I can do Control-Shift-D on Mac at least, or I can even do a Control-D, okay? So for now, I will just choose this right here. All right, and it runs really quickly, and here we are on line 100, and it's waiting for me to tell it what to do, and by it, I mean the IDE, okay? It's waiting for me to tell it what to do. So I'm gonna pull this up here, and I'm just gonna kind of look at these variables here. So down here in this little area, I get to see what we've got going on here. So we've got a variable called this, which refers to the object that is represented by the code that we're looking at right now in this employee class. And I'm sorry if that is a little confusing, but that's one of the objects that we're working with, okay? So that's called this. And it looks like this object is representing Fred Flintstone, and it's a programmer, or if it's of type programmer, okay? And here's some data about it, all right? And we're in this equals method here, and then another object of type programmer got passed into this equals method here, and it is being called O, okay? And if I hover my cursor over this O, I can even see the details of this object right here. And I can also see the details of the object over here, and I can see the details of that object down here. So IntelliJ is giving me a lot of cool ways that I can, understand what I'm dealing with right now. All right, so I can tell that at least for this pair of employees, nothing is going to blow up because, well, actually I shouldn't jump ahead of myself. I don't think anything's going to blow up. Right here, yeah, I see a date of birth, 1900-0101. Let's see. And if I open up this thing here, I can look for the date of birth field. There it is, date of birth. So it's not null, okay? So I know this isn't going to blow up. And so I can actually just let my the program continue to execute. And I can do that with I think F9. Now what's going to happen is I think it's going to come back and stop on this line again, because this code is going to get called for a lot of the employee objects that I have over here. Let me show you. So see here where we have all of these lines. These lines are going to become employee objects that are going to be compared against each other, okay? And so I'm expecting that that equals method is going to get called a lot, okay? So if I let the code continue on, it's going to come back around again and stop on here again, but maybe with a different pair of employees, or at least one of the employees will be a different object, okay? And in fact, let's see here. How can I show you that they're different? Well, I think we can pay attention either to this 1136, okay? I think that's a magic number that we can kind of use to determine, okay, this is a unique programmer instance, 1136 and 1137, okay? So if I let this code go again, yeah, look at that. Now 1190 and 1137, okay? So that's just letting us know that, okay, we're looking at a different this object now, but it looks like the O object is probably the same one, okay? Which is fine, I don't care. All right, so I'm going to open this object up and come down here and look again at the date of birth, okay? And now I see that this also isn't null. It is set to something. So I don't expect anything's gonna blow up here either, okay? So I'm closing that and I'm just gonna go again, okay? So F9 again. So you see how I'm just kind of methodically going through this one employee at a time, and I can open this up and come down here and look again. And again, I see that the date of birth is not null. Now, what if I had, I don't know, 100,000 employees? I would not want to sit here and keep having to, do what I'm doing now, right? It's just not a very efficient way to go about doing things. Well, luckily I don't have to. So let me show you I don't know if I will call this an advanced technique, an intermediate technique of debugging. I can actually tell the IDE, don't just stop on this line, but stop on this line if a certain set of criteria are met, okay? And so what I can do is I can put my cursor over here and right click, and this will let me create a conditional breakpoint, okay? And what I can say is something like, basically, if this .dob equals null, okay? So in other words, don't stop here unless that date of birth field is actually null, because I know that's the situation that caused the null pointer exception, right? Because I looked at that stack trace before I ever even started up the debugger, okay? I saw that there was a null pointer exception. It's occurring on the this.dob field. And so I can tell my debugger here, well, don't stop unless you see that the this.dob is null, okay? And so I will click done, all right? And now I will do an F9 again, and hopefully what's happening now is it skipped over a whole bunch of iterations until it got to one where that criteria was met, okay? And sure enough, look at that, date of birth is now null. All right. And so now I want to understand, okay, why is the date of birth null? Why is that happening? Because I wouldn't have expected that to be the case under normal circumstances. Okay. So now let me just pay more attention to the fields here. Oh, and I see something of interest immediately. What I'm seeing is that the type for this particular employee is not a programmer or an analyst or a CEO or any of those normal data types. It is employee $dummy employee, okay? And that won't mean anything to you if you haven't taken my course and you're like, already in this bit of code. But for the person who ran into this problem, she probably is seeing this now, and maybe alarm bells are going off in her head, hopefully. Okay, so let me explain what's happening here. Let me jump back over to the stream stuff code here, and let me explain these lines very briefly. So this first line here is simply splitting up this whole entire text block into separate lines of text, and then kind of like processing them one line at a time, okay? You can almost think of it kind of like a for each loop or something that's just looping through each line within this string, one at a time, all right? So we've got one line at a time, and then this map method here. In functional programming, anytime you see a map method or function, it is converting one thing to another thing, essentially, okay? And so in this case, it is using this create employee factory method here to convert a string of text into an object of type employee. And this is code that we wrote. And in fact, we're going to jump in here because I know this is where the issue is occurring. So one of those lines of text is getting passed into here. And then essentially what we've got here is this switch, which is basically like an if block, an if-else block. And it's basically looking at one little chunk of the text in here to determine what is the role of that text, okay? And so let me just show you for reference here. So this bit right here, okay, analyst or a manager or a CEO, okay, that's what that little bit of code is doing there. It's looking at that role, and it's basically saying, well, if the role says programmer, then make a new programmer. If the role is manager, then make a new manager. If the role is analyst, then make a new analyst. If the role is CEO, then make a new CEO. But if the role doesn't match any of these at all, then do this default thing here, which is to make something of type dummy employee. Okay, that's an employee that's kind of not a low IQ employee, but like a fake employee. Okay, so it's not a CEO or an analyst or a manager or a programmer. It's just kind of like a placeholder thing so that we don't have to return a null. Okay, a null object. And so I think that is what's happening is we are returning, in fact, I don't think, I see it right here. We are returning an instance of a dummy employee. And the dummy employee class, if I command click or control click on the dummy employee class, well, I can see what this guy does right here. The dummy employee class extends from employee, but it doesn't set any data on the first name, last name, or date of birth, okay? By default, it doesn't do that. And it's inheriting from employees. So I want to see something real quick here. So in the employee class, we are initializing the last name to NA, and we're initializing the first name to NA. But look at what we're doing with the date of birth. We are not setting it to anything at all in this code, okay? And so it is null. And if that is null, you're going to get a null pointer exception if you try to, reference it in some kind of way. I think we may have found our issue. It is the fact that the date of birth field for a dummy employee is by default null. And maybe we don't want that. So now we can decide, okay, what do we want to do about that? And I can think of 2 or 3 ways off the top of my head that we could relatively easily address this issue now that we know what the issue is, okay? One is that just as we are initializing the first and last names to some value so that it's not empty or null, we could do the same thing here with the date of birth. In fact, I guess let's go ahead and just do that, okay? And that is actually, yeah, there it is right there. In fact, we're setting it to null currently, okay? So let's just set it to something other than null, okay? I think that's going to be the easiest thing to do. So maybe I will do a local date. Now, this is going to be a date a date that we don't actually care about, okay? And because we don't care about it, I don't want to set it to something like that could be like a realistic date, okay? And so what I'm thinking of doing here is maybe setting it to this constant here of min, which I think should represent the earliest date that the local date is capable of representing, okay? And that should be probably a date way, way back in history somewhere. If I hover over this, let's see, yeah, it's like minus a bunch of nines and stuff. So that's probably one easy way to do this. Now, in real life, I might not really want to do it this way, although I might do it this way because it's just so easy to do. But I don't know. There are potentially better ways to do this, but I don't think I can get into those ways in this video here. I don't want to make this any longer than it has to be for right now. So yeah, let's try this approach. So let me see here. I'm going to stop this. And then I'm going to jump back over to the stream stuff, and I'm just going to run this again. But this time I'm not going to run it in debug mode because I have a feeling I've solved this problem now. I'm just going to run it the regular way with a control R. And let's see if it blows up. Hey, look at that. It doesn't blow up anymore. Okay. So that problem is solved. All right. So hopefully enough of you who are watching this have enough background on Java and the equals and hash code methods and the streams API and all of that, that this lesson or video will be meaningful to you. If not, and you stuck around anyway, but you didn't really fully understand what I was doing here, I would encourage you very much to, come by my course where you'll learn all about this, including you'll learn how to do debugging in the IDE as well. And for that student who had this issue, I hope you learned a lot to see how I, was able to troubleshoot this. So like I said, I will almost definitely make plenty more videos like this from time to time as I get students reaching out to me with various issues that I think would be kind of good ones to show how do you solve this problem, right? Like how do you debug this or troubleshoot this issue, okay? So yeah, this covers at least one way that you can debug and troubleshoot issues in the IDE. So yeah, go buy my course if you're interested in learning more about this stuff and you haven't already bought it. And with that, I will see you in the next one.